While a majority of Cuban Americans still believe that the embargo should be maintained, there is an increasing number of people who want to change, a significant change in U.S. policy toward Cuba. One of the big issues that has become increasingly divisive among Cuban Americans is the whole question of who can visit the island, who can send money back to the island, and what are the guidelines that are going to determine the deepness of the relationship that a person can have with his or her family back on the island.
Roughly a quarter of the population of Greater Miami area is of Cuban origin, with 650,000 Cubans having arrived in waves in the aftermath of Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution. And as Camila Gallardo explains, they have strong family ties to those they left behind.
With Hispanic groups, whether they're Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, our extended family is an important part of our family. We consider it a nuclear family. Some people are raised by aunts or uncles or second cousins. And so restricting the ability for us to send them humanitarian aid in the form of cash or whatever it may be, which actually helps them become independent of the communist state, has been a real problem.
Student Giancarlo Sopo couldn't agree more. According to him, real change in Cuba can only begin by lifting travel restrictions.
My mom should be able to visit her family freely, and that's the only way we can bring about change in Cuba.
And as Hillary Clinton stated during a previous Senate hearing, President Obama, the first U.S. president born after the 1959 revolution, has listened to these concerns and is in favor of lifting travel and trade restrictions to Cuba and redefining the meaning of nuclear family.
The president-elect is committed to lifting the family travel restrictions and the remittance restrictions. He believes, and I think it's a very wise insight, that Cuban Americans are the best ambassadors for democracy, freedom, and a free market economy.
So after this first step, what's next for Cuba and its relationship with the U.S.? Are there more changes to come? Will President Obama have an open dialogue with Raul Castro? Or are we just going back to the policies of the 90s and everything else will remain the same?
Sarah Stevens, let's talk about what that congressional delegation was doing down there. It seems like they've hived off the embargo argument for another day and are talking about gradual opening, including first, a lifting of the travel ban. An audacious move, an incremental move? How should we view this American delegation down in Cuba?
Well, I think it's marvelous. I think it's very important that they made the trip. I think it's interesting and significant that President Raul Castro met with them. They are the first U.S. delegation to have a meeting with President Raul Castro. I think more important, though, and I say this as someone who has been on many, many trips to Cuba with members of Congress, what's important is the other people that they have the opportunity to talk to. Cubans on the streets, Cuban dissidents, Cuban artists and cultural figures. That's how you really begin to understand what's really going on in Cuba today. Not 50 years ago, but today.
But can you say with any confidence that that delegation hasn't been given a Potemkin village view of Cuba, people who aren't being marginalized, beaten, arrested without charge, and really a cross-section of today's Cuban society?
Well, I find it very interesting that there are so many people in the United States who are willing to speak on behalf of Cubans, and we so rarely actually listen to what Cubans have to say. It's ridiculous to say that you go to the island and you don't interact with and come in contact with regular Cubans. You do. You can't help it. I've done it. I've been on 30 trips to Cuba in the last 8 years. It's inevitable, and you hear everything. There are many, many, many different opinions about the United States, about U.S. policy, about the Castro regime, and Cubans are not worried about talking to foreigners about their points of view.
Adolfo?
Well, the problem is, of course, the Cuban people aren't free to speak. They never can vote. They live in a repressive society. They are to deny all the basic freedoms, and people, frankly, who come from the United States are often, not Sarah, but apologists for the Castro regime. You know, I heard these stories, of course, in the 70s and the 60s when people visited communist China and they, praised Mao and the rest of it. It's a very different story today. When you talk about a society that is repressed and closed, where there is no election, where there is no voice, you're listening to the voice of the regime. And I'm glad you asked the question about Patuxent Village, because it's exactly right. This is a facade. Now, I just wanted to dispel a couple things. First of all, there have been many delegations, Sarah and others have been on them. This is just the latest in a series of parades of delegations of people who've gone to Cuba. Congresswoman Lee said this is the moment for change. With all due respect, Ray, I think the question should be posed, what's changed in Cuba, or what has the Cuban government done to warrant a change in U.S. policy, specifically with respect to a path toward democracy and change on the island and freedom of expression, not cosmetic changes, and not what has it done to dismantle its state security apparatus and to give the freedoms that we enjoy in the United States to the people of Cuba. That should be the question before we reward Cuba.